So let's talk through some thundering tracked vehicles, mighty hover constructions, and stomping behemoths with big firepower, with an overview of every faction's battle tanks in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking tanks and war machines, and in this video I thought we'd do a big roundup of each faction's battle tanks and war machines, roughly how they work in game, and how strong I'd rate them at the moment. Tanks and war machines have generally been having quite a good time of it in 10th edition. Compared with 9th and before, they've often been a bit more central to their relative armies, often being the only things that have the firepower that you need to counteract their rivals. The big toughness characteristics that they get, meaning that you either need a whole bunch of dedicated anti-tank weapons or a bunch of stacking special rules to take them down. As a result, they often tend to be fairly important to most of the armies out there, though in 40k there's all manner of different fighting war machines serving different roles. For this video I'm going to aim to talk through just about every tank out there in Warhammer 40k, which in itself is a pretty enormous topic, so we're going to go through fairly quickly and try not to get bogged down too much. And for this one, to keep the number at least kind of sane, I'm going to limit by a whole bunch of criteria. In general, no super heavies unless it's quite clearly a tank or has the feel of one. They feel like they're standing above in a class of their own if they're big stompy robots. For the most part, I'm going to stick to things that are 11 wounds or more. That generally seems to be the rough cut-off for battle tanks in Warhammer 40k. Most of the rest that are lighter than that, more feeling like light vehicles of one sort or another. For the most part, no dedicated transport vehicles, aside from ones that really have a very clear part of their value being as sort of gun tanks, and their transport capacity is just one thing that they bring to the table. I'm going to leave out artillery, fortifications, aircraft, speeder-style vehicles, and chariots, all of which feel like they're more members of their own classes as opposed to mainline damage and defense things for one reason or another. And for the big tanks and vehicles themselves, I'm going to focus on the ones where their primary purpose is shooting, so for the most part no equal hybrids like things like the Soul Grinder, Redemptor Dreadnought or Defiler, where they can do a bunch of shooting but also have a very clear melee threat as well, and that feels like it's part of their theme. I won't exclude walkers entirely though, as there's plenty of things that more sort of fit the bill as walking tanks out there. As ever, if you're looking to pick up any Warhammer 40k miniatures, be they tanks, fighting vehicles or other stuff out there, feel free to check out the channel's affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description. They save money versus Games Workshop, usually between 10 and 20%, and they help to support Auspex Tactics a little bit if you use any of these specific links to buy things. A big thank you to anyone using them. Let's jump into the big list of tanks though, and first up we'll start with the Space Marines, move through then the rest of the Imperium, and then go on to Chaos then Xenos. First up for the Space Marines, we've got the iconic Predator tanks. The destructor is 140 points, and it's generally in the past tended to be the more infantry-focused killing Space Marine tank. In 10th edition, its chunky autocannon is rapid fire 2, and brings a bunch of strength 9, AP 1, damage 3 shooting, and despite a special rule that gives you extra AP against infantry, it often tends to be backed up by las cannons, making for really quite a general purpose gun turret tank. Overall, they're pretty easy to use, going to have at least some good value against any targets that they fire against, quite nice for killing heavy infantry with the extra AP. I previously would have rated a bit higher, but after they went up to 140 points, it feels like they're a little bit less standout than they used to be. I've given them 7 out of 10 in my arbitrary power rating here. Next up, we've got the Predator Annihilator, 135 points for its las cannon cousin, armed with a twin las cannon turret, and then 2 more las cannons on the sponsons. Its special rule is to get reroll damage rolls against monsters and vehicles, now no longer locks 2 rolls of 1 via the balance data slate. Again, it feels like at least a fairly well balanced tank, okay durability and okay damage output, but again less standout than some of the other things that the Space Marines can bring to bear. I don't think it really needed to go up to the 135 points to be honest. I've also given it a 7 out of 10 here. For their Primaris rivals, the Gladiator series of tanks basically feels like the Primaris Hover Predator. The Primaris tank designs throbbing across the board on powerful anti-grav plates, the larger ones like the Repulsor crushing all things before them. The Gladiator tanks feel like the update for the Predators. I'm not sure how long the Predator tanks will stay around as a result. I guess we'll find out in the next edition most likely. In any case, they have slightly boosted durability, 12 wounds at toughness 10, they still aren't really all that tough for their 160 points cost, and the Gladiator Lancer is the fearsome anti-tank variant of it, packing a massive laser destroyer with 2 shots at strength 14, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 3, rerolling a hit, wound and damage results. The long range and inbuilt rerolls just means they're fantastically easy to add into a list and basically guarantee that you've got some devastating anti-tank firepower that's not reliant on Oath of Moments to help it out. They're quite often added into competitive lists as a pair. Overall I rate them pretty highly. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here. For the anti-infantry variant, we've got the Gladiator Reaper. This one boasts a serious amount of firepower with twin heavy onslaught Gatling cannons, 12 shots at strength 6 and devastating wounds with twin links, and it gets sustained hits 2 against any enemy infantry it targets. That actually means that with the mortal wounds, it's incredibly efficient both against 1 wound infantry as you'd expect, but also puts in solid work against heavier things like Terminators. Often extra anti-horde and anti-infantry isn't necessarily the first thing that Space Marine lists need to add in, but these can often be a good choice alongside a more heavily armoured list, maybe in Ironstorm Spearhead where they get some good stratagems. Can be nice to have a tank for some dedicated anti-horde. I've given it an 8 out of 10 here. Finally for the Gladiators, there's the close-range hard-hitting Gladiator Valiant. That one packs a twin Las Talon and then multi-melter sponsons, meaning that you want to get it within 18 inches ideally to be able to hand out all of its mid-strength firepower. Its damage profiles mean that it's really quite good against heavy infantry, and it isn't awful against vehicles, getting a +1 to hit against the closest monster or vehicle target, though it's maybe a bit unfortunate that you have to wound them on a 5+ most of the time, unless you have boosted Oath of Moment on the go. Unfortunately, compared with the rest, I feel like this one just gets fairly overshadowed, still fairly fragile, and needing to get extra close compared with the others. I've given it a 6.5 out of 10 as a result, maybe a tiny bit better in Fight Almost Alt Force with the advance and shoot and the extra strength up close. Next up, we have the Mighty Vindicator that has certainly seen a bit of a resurgence later in 10th edition. 185 points for the Space Marine Siege tank, equipped with a Mighty Dozer Blade and up-armoured to be able to trek its way towards enemy fortifications and knock them flat. The Vindicator is quite a tough tank, 11 wounds at toughness 11 with a 2+ save, really quite hard to take down in cover or with Armour of Contempt on the go. And then that Mighty Demolisher Cannon gets you d6 plus 3 shots at strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6, meaning that it does have really good damage potential both against medium infantry and against heavy vehicles, but it is also really quite swingy due to multiple d6 rolls. It can fire in close combat as well, which is quite a nice boost given that it needs to get kind of close with a 24-inch range. In general, these things have been very popular in Space Marine lists recently, quite nice to add in as a gun tank to support whatever other strategy you're using, and extra nice in Ironstorm Spearhead with those inbuilt rerolls and good focuses of stratagems there. I've given it an 8.5 out of 10. Before we move on to other Space Marine tanks and beyond, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Cubicle 7 Games, and they're basically the makers of a line of role-playing games for Warhammer 40K, officially licensed products from Games Workshop, maybe best known for their Wrath and Glory and Imperium Maledictum ones. The basic idea for these ones is for people who are interested in playing sort of a Dungeons & Dragons type system but within the Warhammer 40k universe. They're game packs aimed at small groups, usually 6 players or fewer, and the idea behind their Imperium Maledictum one is that it's set on the grueling hive world of Rukkarth, where you take command of one of a whole bunch of Imperial agents and adventure through the city. They've got a ton of fairly fleshed out character classes that you can play as, everything from an Adeptus Mechanicus tech priest, Astra Militarum officers, Imperialis fleet agents, or an Inquisitor. They have some fully created characters that you could jump into, though plenty of room to write your own lore and backstory for them, for those wanting to flesh out their own role. Where I've seen it reviewed on Reddit and the like, generally the game system has been really quite well received, lots of fairly crunchy rules that can govern all sorts of interactions within the hive cities and the things that you might encounter, and plenty of inspiration to draw on from settings within the hive. If you want to check it out, it'll be linked down in the video description. I'll link their Imperium Maledictum starter set, where you get the core rulebook for the system, a Hive City content guide, and a bunch of useful extras for in-game. They also come with a PDF version that can get emailed out to you on purchase for handy access to the rules. They've got plenty more content out there with Inquisitor stuff as well. You can do a bit more research online if you'd like. But in any case, a massive thank you to them for sponsoring the video. You can find them links down in the video description if you'd like to check them out. Back to the Space Marine armour though, and next up we have the Mighty Land Raiders, one of the most iconic 40k tanks out there, a great rumbling fortress of adamantium, sporting some big guns, and able to disgorge an elite squad of warriors into the centre of the fight. The regular Godhammer variant is 240 points packing the las cannons. Land Raiders are really sturdy with 12 wounds at toughness 16 and a 2+ save, again very nice with Armour of Contempt if they need it. The las cannons on this one get 2 shots each, so a big 4 anti-tank shots plus a heavy bolter, and then their signature move is their assault ramp special rule, being able to move up 10 inches, drop the squad 3 inches out the front, and then they can still charge, so really quite a big threat range for a squad on the board. In general, I feel like Land Raiders are pretty usable for the role that they want to fill. They'll need the right unit to go in, maybe things like Assault Centurions, Gravis with characters attached, or anything else that moves slowly but can do some massive damage up close. They are quite a big commitment and often get skipped over if you can either fit in either another transport or you're in a detachment that can advance and charge. They're still pretty solid value though, and certainly one way that you can get things done, and then will be a tough presence on the board to take down after that. I've given the regular one a 7.5 out of 10. There's two other variants though, the Crusader with the Hurricane Bolters, potentially spitting out 24 twin link shots with those bolters, utterly shredding hordes, and then doubling down on that with the twin assault cannon. This one's cheaper and gets a bigger transport capacity, though I think its damage output being quite so limited to enemy infantry and hordes is a big weakness, unless you do need the 8 slots in this one for say transporting Gravis with 2 attached characters, then it's probably better to go for one of the others. Finally, there's the Land Raider Redeemer, a big 285 points now with its Flamestorm cannons, each one getting d6 plus 3 shots at strength 6, AP minus 2 and damage 2, meaning that's pretty brutal anti-elite infantry firepower and very nasty overwatch if enemies dare to move around within 12 inches of it. It's got the slightly bigger transport capacity, so enough for Gravis with 1 character. I'd still say it's probably the best out of the Land Raider variants, even though it costs more. Very likely to make its presence felt with those Flamestorms. I've given it an 8 out of 10 here. Could be nice in combination with Vulcan Hestarn or in Firestorm maybe. Next up, we've got the Primaris vehicle of the Land Raiders sort of weight class in the Repulsor and the Executioner. Again, these roll along on their grav plates and can be hard for enemies to get near them due to the massive grav backwash that can shove enemies back or crush them beneath its bulk. They also get a pretty respectable stat line, 16 wounds at toughness 12 again, but with only a 3+ save, so not quite as indomitable. The Repulsor gets really quite a lot of anti-infantry style guns, a couple of big things like a las cannon and twin las cannon, and then a lot of shots between its secondary guns and its defensive array. The Repulsors may be the premium transport of choice for big squads of ranged infantry, maybe things like Eradicators or perhaps Hellblasters. Can be very nice to get them into effective threat range before they get shot, and then also protect them against enemy charges, where if you charge the unit that's next to the Repulsor, they can embark back within the tank. Overall, pretty respectable amounts of defensive stats, damage, and utility for the cost. I'd probably be more tempted if there's a big central shooting combo that you're trying to get into range though. I've given it an 8 out of 10 here. Its cousin with the big gun is the Repulsor Executioner, 40 points more for a much more of a main battle tank style role, either getting the choice of the heavy laser destroyer with 2 big hitting shots at strength 16 and damage d6 plus 4, or going for the macroplasma with the strength 9 and damage 3. In general, more people tend to take the laser destroyer, though a few more have taken macroplasmas since the boosted oath thing, as that got a fair bit better against tough stuff if you can guarantee that you're getting +1 to wound against them. It also has a Gatling cannon and a defensive array, plus a boosted rule against injured stuff and a small transport capacity. Again, I rate these as usable enough. They may be better in things like Ironstorm Spearhead, where the inbuilt rerolls can be really big for the heavy laser destroyer, and also it feels like one of the best users of stratagems in that detachment. Quite efficient for damage buffs when you're buffing 220 points worth of tank or support with things like Tech Marines. Overall, I've given it an 8 out of 10, a solid amount of tank threat and stats for the cost. Next up, I thought I'd also mention the Ballistus Dreadnought, essentially having the function of a walking tank. With the new resurrected ranged Dreadnought that came out in the Leviathan box set, it's 140 points, is toughness 10 and 12 wounds with a 2+ save, so genuinely quite sturdy for the cost, and then hits with 2 las cannon shots and 2 missile launchers that get to re-roll the hit roll if your target's above half strength. These things have been really quite popular in recent Space Marine armies, particularly for forces getting the +1 to wound oath of moment, where the missile launcher and its low strength might matter a little bit less there. Quite common to see these and Vindicators taken to the field en masse to present a big wall of durable 2+ armour. Though again, like the Predators, maybe feel like they've just lost a little bit of their shine since their points went up a bit. I've chosen to give the Ballistus Dreadnought an 8.5 out of 10 here. Finally, beyond the core Codex Space Marines, they also have the Astrius, the super heavy grav tank that takes Primaris grav things to the next level, 525 points for a great big behemoth at 24 wounds, toughness 12 and a 2+ save. That's certainly a whole load of tank for the stats. It's armed with a macroplasma accelerator cannon with a bunch of shots at strength 9 and damage 3, and then 2 fairly punchy sponsons, either with d6 plasma shots at strength 8 damage 3 or 2 las cannon style shots. I think it's interesting enough being a big chunky tank that is going to have a lot of threat and can take buffs quite well. There generally isn't one that you tend to see on competitive tables due to its enormous size partly. There's going to be large areas of the board that it just won't be able to go into just because it's too bulky to fit through gaps. And it also doesn't really help too much that for quite such a big and expensive model, the accelerator cannon is only AP1, which potentially is going to be a big deal against things like 2+ or 3+ save things that get cover. Overall, I've given it a 5 out of 10 here, though I do think that in reality it would give quite a lot of armies a bit more trouble if you could guarantee that it could move around the board adequately. Several armies might struggle to take down this kind of profile in a reasonable sort of time. In general, probably better off with multiple other gun tanks though. Otherwise, for Divergent Chapter Space Marines, we've got the Barb Predator of the Blood Angels, 135 points for the basic Predator stat line. The lore behind this one was they've used some Infernus pattern engines that makes the tank go a lot faster and some different turret options, and chosen not to share their designs with the Mechanicus, much to their annoyance. The battle can choose either a big flamestorm cannon or a twin assault cannon for its top gun. In general, people go for the flamestorm cannon to have some punchy midfield threats and some fairly big overwatch. It can overwatch all the way out to 18 inches and might often be backed up by heavy flamers to help it out within 12. It can also advance and shoot all its guns at base as well, so it can move really quite quickly between 12 inches, that and its big shooting profiles. Overall, they're nasty enough to have as a mid-board overwatch and infantry clearing threat. They do tend to act as a bit of an oddball unit within Blood Angels though, not really playing into their main strengths, and their points cost did go up a bit alongside their codex. I've given them a 7 out of 10 for power overall, feeling usable but not so standout. Finally, for Divergent chapter tanks, worth mentioning the Black Templar variant. They basically get a whole bunch of repulsors, impulsors and gladiators with 10 points for an extra bolt-on multi-melter. Not really very big differences with that and not really too much more to say. In general, I feel like that trade-off is a pretty reasonable one. It does mean their tanks are more expensive, but also more threat with a pretty meaningful gun. Seems like it's quite a nice win for the impulsor in particular, though it might depend a bit on how you're using the other big gun tanks. Moving beyond the Astartes now though, and let's get into the many tanks of the Imperial Guard. First up, we've got the mighty Leman Russ battle tank and its variants, iconic workhorse of the Guard with its World War I style sponsons, providing enormous firepower to take down the biggest threats to humanity, with great flexibility of the different turret options and roles that it can be adapted to. The standard Russ is 175 points, it's a big 13 wounds at toughness 11 with a 2+ save, so a very sturdy battle tank there, more so in cover or using smoke. The chassis has a bunch of good guns mounted on it, usually a las cannon on the hull, often multi-melters on the side sponsons, though you could take other options. There's a heavy stubber on top and a hunter-killer missile, so really quite a lot of threat before you even get to the main gun. For that one, for the standard Russ, you get the mighty battle cannon, D6 plus 3 shots at strength 10, AP 1 and damage 3, and then one of the biggest selling points of the regular Russ is its armoured spearhead special rule, allowing you to re-roll hit rolls against things on objectives. That applies to everything including the non-main cannon as well, so it just means it's a lot more threat than some of the other variants out there. The main battle cannon profile is quite nice for any buffing rules that you might be able to give to it, particularly things that add AP or ignores cover, as some of the other tanks can provide. As a result, they're one of the most popular tank variants for the Guard. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Leman Russ Demolisher. This one's 190 points and gets you the same chassis but swaps out the reroll rule for the firing combat one, kind of similar to the Vindicator, and its Demolisher battle cannon is D6 plus 1 shots at strength 14, AP 3 and damage D6, so it basically lost 2 compared with what it was previously before the Codex, which was quite a big blow to its damage output. As a result, while still being one of the most expensive Russes, it's just not quite as standout as it used to be. Certainly not unusable, but rarely seen in comparison to its competitors. I've given it a 7 out of 10. The Vanquisher is the variant that gets the really long barrel battle cannon, designed to destroy enemy tanks and monsters. That gets you just the one shot, but with a heavy keyword, so if you're static it'll hit on a 3+. You get to reroll wound rolls against monsters and vehicles, and it hits at a mighty strength 18, AP 4 and damage D6 plus 6, so at least a reasonable kind of chance to just one-shot an enemy tank or vehicle. Obviously they're enormously hit and miss, but what makes up for that is that they're just very cheap compared with the rest of the Russ variants. It's only 145 points, and you still get all of the rest of the guns plus the Russ defensive stats, and it means they're one of the more efficient ones and played a bit more in competitive lists compared with some. I've given them an 8 out of 10 here overall. The Leman Russ Punisher is the brutal Gatling Russ, the Punisher Gatling cannon getting you a big 20 shots, hitting at strength 6, AP 0, damage 1, and getting devastating wounds against things that aren't monsters and vehicles to help it out against heavier infantry. It does mean that compared with the other Russes, it's the best at taking out one wound infantry, but kind of falls down against any of the other targets in comparison. It does have the advantage of being one of the cheaper Russes at 150 points, but in general it's just not really the sort of firepower that you normally need to add to a Guard army. Astra Militarum just tend to be pretty good against lighter infantry anyway, with plenty of las guns, stubbers, and other bolt-on guns on their gun tanks to spare. It's not unusable, though it's still rated as one of the weaker variants. I've given it a 6.5 out of 10 here. The Plasma Tank variant is the Leman Russ Executioner, 170 points for an elite killing plasma cannon, D6 plus 3 shots at strength 8, AP minus 3 and damage 3, so pretty nasty against heavy infantry and having more AP than most variants. It gets a slightly special rule for a +1 to hit against enemies below half strength, and it's sort of mid-cost at 170 points. In general, for mainline damage dealing, it tends to get passed over for the more regular Russ, though I still don't think it's too bad, and maybe does better out of the combined regiment compared with some. Lethal hits on that profile does make it really quite general purpose. It does come with a downside of having the chance of dealing damage to itself though, particularly more so if you choose to pair it with some plasma sponsons. Overall I've given it a 7.5 out of 10. The Ross Exterminator is the autocannon variant. This one gives you 8 shots out to 24 inches or 4 shots beyond that, or hitting at strength 9, AP 1, damage 3 and twin links. The damage profile isn't awful, though overall doesn't really quite compare 1 for 1 to the regular Ross due to its rerolls on the rest of the guns, but the autocannon does give you a pretty excellent debuff rule, meaning that an enemy that gets hit by it gets debuffed by AP -1, so any other firepower that piles into the same target is a bit more effective. As a result, it just can be pretty useful to have in guard tank lines, even if it maybe feels like its damage output is paying a bit of a premium for that special rule. Overall a very solid variant, again often seen in competitive lists, and I've given it an 8.5 out of 10 here. The Eradicator is 170 points, and this one gets you the Eradicator Nova Cannon, more shots than most of the Rosses with D3 plus 6 shots rather than D6 plus 3, hitting at strength 7, AP -1, damage 2 and ignore cover. Despite the extra shots and the ignores cover thing, it still tends to be a bit on the underwhelming side unless you're taking aim at say standard Space Marines or weaker. Almost all the other variants will still deal a bit more damage overall, but it does get its interesting special rule in that it's really quite hard to take down at long range. If the tank has the benefit of cover, then you get to subtract 1 from the damage of enemy attacks that target it, and provided you can be at range and in cover, that basically makes it the sturdiest of the Lehman Ross variants in that situation by really quite a long way. It's definitely interesting and could be a good sort of counter gunline tank, particularly if you know that you've got infantry targets to attack, or maybe if you could coordinate it so the enemy is shooting this one first. It still hasn't added up to it being included in competitive lists much though. That still mainly seems to be the battle tank, vanquisher and exterminator, and having its damage output being limited to being good against infantry is quite a big weakness. Overall I've given it a 7 out of 10. Finally, we've got the Lehman Ross Tank Commander, the HQ choice that you can give enhancements if you want to. This one's a big 235 points, so paying around about 50 points more for the exact same stat line, meaning it's not typically going to do so well on the damage and defensive sort of front, and did get a sort of stealth nerf, as the gun it usually tended to take was the Demolisher Cannon, and that got significantly worse in the Codex. What it does come with is orders though, and it gets 2 of them, 2 units within 12 inches. It's an efficient source of tank orders, and its special rule is quite a good one as well. When it's destroyed, provided it's destroyed at range, roll a d6, and on a 2+, you get to shoot with it before it dies. And with the entire firepower of a Lehman Ross firing out of sequence, that can be quite a big deal indeed. Maybe dealing a bunch of damage to something that was just about to charge you perhaps. Overall, again, I'd say they're not unusable, though they do feel really quite overshadowed by the Rogue or Dawn tank commanders, just due to the very small difference in points cost between them and the really big tank. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10. I feel like the points difference between the regular sized Rosses and the Rogue or Dawns needs to be quite a lot bigger. Speaking of Dawns, first up we have the regular battle tank though, the recently introduced Astra Militarum heavy tank, also bearing the name of a Primarch. 18 wounds at toughness 12, and basically trying to do the Lehman Ross but bigger essentially, and of course covered in sponsons and bearing yet more guns. It does take quite a lot of dice rolling to fire with these things. The regular tank is 240 points, and it's 18 wounds at a 2+ save with toughness 12, not unkillable but really solid defensive stats for the points cost, slightly better than a Land Raider. It gets multi-melter sponsons, stubbers versus melter guns, and then in general for the primary armament it usually tends to take the Pulverizer Cannon for a bunch of closest range damage 3, and then the mighty general purpose Oppressor Cannon with a bunch of strength 12 and damage 3 shots at longer range. The regular Dawn also gets its special rule to reduce a single attack to damage 0, which could be handy enough when you're wounded by something big and threatening with a massive damage characteristic like an enemy railgun or Vanquisher perhaps. Overall the Dawn tanks are solid and easy to use, lots of general purpose damage that's going to be hard to go too far wrong with, and certain armies are going to struggle to chew through that big profile. Again, I'd say perhaps one of the biggest downsides for the regular battle tank is that there's the tank commander version that exists and is so close in points to it, but even so you can still use these if you want to have the defensive special rule and pay a little bit less for the cost. I've given it an 8 out of 10 overall. As mentioned though, we've got its equivalent tank commander datasheet. This one's basically 25 points more than the regular Rogue or Dawn, comes with the same weapons and war gear, but its special rules are quite different. The main one being that it can order 2 squadron units, so it can order itself. That's just really helpful for coordination, meaning that it always gets the +1 to hit or the extra movement when you need it, and can also be a synergy piece as well, helping out another tank nearby. It doesn't get the canceller damage style special rule, but it does get one that allows you to reroll 1 hit roll, wound roll and damage roll each time it attacks, and that'll add up to a fair bit more firepower over the course of the game. Plus they do pretty well with the 2 most commonly played guard attachments at the moment. Dawn profile's quite enjoying lethal hits from Combined Arms Regiment, and doing well with all the tank synergies plus certain enhancements that you can give it in the Hammer of the Emperor. They can work well enough with tech priests as well. Overall, it still feels like one of the scarier and easier to use tanks in Warhammer 40k. I've given it a big 9.5 out of 10 here. When I did a recent video taking a look at guide competitive lists, rounding up units that were used in every single one of those, it did look like this one was used in absolutely every single one of them. Pretty well, and also includes status for most with the Astra Militarum right now. Next up, we've got the Guard Flame Tank in the Hellhound, often given a wide berth by their soldiers in arms for the reputation for having the potential to blow up. They do have other weapon options, but the ones in 40k at the moment often tend to take their signature Inferno Cannon, 2d6 torrent auto hits at strength 6, AP 2, damage 1, plus a hull mounted weapon, and there's fairly good arguments for all three of the different guns there. More Overwatch, handing out its special rule at longer range, or a punchy multi-melter for damage. The Hellhound's debuff rule is that it strips cover from an enemy unit, so you can hit something with one of its weapons, and then other guard units targeting the same target get to ignore cover. That's really nice for certain things like battle cannons or rogal dawns. They do seem to be seeing a bunch of competitive play between that utility and their damage, and they also are a little bit sturdier than Chimera chassis with a 2+ save as well. Overall solid enough, I've given them an 8 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Anti-Air Hydra Flak Tank, 95 points again for a Chimera chassis with 11 wounds, this one mounting a great big quad autocannon, 4 shots at strength 9, AP 1, damage 3, but with anti-fly 2+, twin linked, and re-rolling hit rolls against the fly keyword. As to whether or not it's going to be particularly good in any one matchup, it's going to get vastly better if there are fly things to target around, but even then it's probably not going to be crazy standout, just chipping in a bit of extra damage turn on turn, while being quite a cheap and expendable little tank. I'll probably rate it somewhere around the sort of 6.5 to 7 kind of mark. In general, I feel like for damage dealers, Russes and Dawns would likely do better for the most part for the guard, though it feels like it's not awful if you wanted another gun tank, and these are all the points that you had left. Finally, for the Astra Militarum, we have the Mighty Baneblade variants, iconic rumbling battle fortresses well known from the Dawn of War franchise, all covered in masses of guns with a whole host of different varieties available to take aim at various different enemy targets. In game, they cost somewhere between 440 points or up to 500-ish. Are really quite sturdy and hard to take down. 24 wounds at toughness 13 and a 2+ save is going to be more than some armies can handle, and particularly not great for armies that have a bunch of strength 12 weapons if they went heavy on the las cannons for anti-tank. The different variants have a whole host of different firepower options, some of them may be a little bit more interesting in general purpose than most. In general, I'd go for the ones that can handle enemy heavy targets well though, given that you can't really afford too much to have this amount of points investment not good against some of the biggest, scariest enemy heavy hitters in their army. I'm not going to go through each of the variants in this video, maybe it could be one for another follow-up video at some point focusing on them. In general though, it feels like Games Workshop just hasn't balanced them very well versus the Leman Russes and Rogal Dawns. Lack of the squadron keyword means they can't get a whole bunch of synergies and options within the codex. Not allowing Lord Solar to order them was really quite a big blow to the big battle fortresses. Even though they might be able to rumble through some walls in the Hammer of the Emperor detachment, it would have been quite nice to have that on their datasheet potentially, as the enormous footprint of the tank can often get caught up behind terrain in busy tabletops. Overall, I've given them a 5.5 out of 10 overall. At the moment, I just don't think they're particularly well balanced and could do with either a points cut or some other draw to make them a bit more tempting versus just taking the weight in points in Rogal Dawns or Leman Russes. Moving on from the many tanks in the Imperial Guard, next up we have the Adeptus Custodes. In the main codex they have their venerable Land Raider, 240 points for a rather fancy Land Raider plated in gold and providing a bit of accurate las cannon fire. Hitting on a 2+ is a nice advantage compared with some of the other variants out there. They still have their transport capacity and ability to deliver Custodes into combat from away, though in general they tend to get passed up just for foot slogging Custodes in the vast majority of army lists. They typically tend to be tanky enough that you don't need the armoured bulk to protect them. Terminators have their teleport rules, and Blade Champions can have nearly as long a threat as the Land Raider when they advance and charge, so aren't very tempting for units using those. Not completely unplayable, but certainly very niche. I've given them a 6 out of 10 here. From their Forge World roster though, they have the Mighty Caladius tank. These ones have generally been a staple of anti-tank firepower for them, and have done well throughout 10th edition. Relic tanks with ancient technologies that were given only to the Adeptus Custodes, and making sure that they can still adequately outclass the competition. Caladius tanks are 215 points, they have 14 wounds at toughness 11 with a 2+ save and a 5+ invulnerable, and that's pretty adequate durability for the cost. And then they tend to be armed with the big anti-tank loadout, 4 shots at strength 12, AP -3 and damage d6 +2 with the heavy blaze cannon, getting twin links and lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, so typically the vast majority of those accurate attacks that hit will wound. With a good roll, they can easily be taking out their equivalents for say 11 wound battle tanks and enemy armies in a single round of shooting. Overall generally very powerful, maybe extra useful in the Custodes Solar Spearhead vehicle focus one, and maybe not even too bad in lines of the Emperor either, as they can actually provide some fire support to units while not getting too close to them. Overall I've given them a 9 out of 10. Next up, for the Adepta Sororitas, we have the Castigator, basically the Sisters version of a Predator tank pretty much, providing some holy fire support that can actually deal some good damage at long range, to contrast with their love for Melters and Flamers up close. They've got the similar Predator defensive stat line, though it's not really as durable for the cost, given that this one costs a big 170 points. Most people tend to go for the Battle Cannon, d6 plus 3 shots at strength 10, AP minus 1 and damage 3, or with Ignores cover. Generally the Ignores cover maybe being the biggest factor to beat out the auto cannons. They also have a Hunter Killer missile and a trio of heavy bolters for some nice volume fire that's really good against the right targets. Their biggest and best thing is their special rule though, again a similar sort of AP debuff to the Leman Russ Exterminator, meaning that if you hit a target then other things that focus down that target will find it easier to do so. So a nice buff for things like Flamers getting close, or the Bolters or Castigators. Overall still feel like a pretty solid choice for the Sisters. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10. They definitely feel a bit on the expensive side compared with what they used to though, at a big 170 points for their abilities. Otherwise for the Sisters, I thought I'd mention the Immolator as well. I know this one's a dedicated transport, so maybe shouldn't count by the earlier criteria, but I feel like it's pretty much as much a gun turret as a transport vehicle. Plus it's just really cool looking with its big stained glass window type affair, providing some Emperor Blessed protection to the gunner behind. These are often taken to split Battle Sister squads in half, meaning that you can have multiple units of 5 which can help out with the Miracle Dice and the sticky objectives, and potentially have the dangerous models move forward and deal some melter damage, while the more basic Bolter Sisters sit behind and guard the home field objective. Otherwise they also chip in with a pair of multi-melters and a heavy bolter. Some take the Immolation Flamers for a bunch of Torrent Overwatch, and they also get a nice shooting debuff rule like the Castigator, stripping cover from one target until the end of the phase, so again could help out other holy firepower pouring into the same targets. A pretty efficient little tank and transport hybrid. I've chosen to give it an 8 out of 10 here. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, first up we've got their crab tank in the Onager Dunecrawler. 155 points for a curious walking contraption shrouded by force fields. Their points cost, they're fairly sturdy, 11 wounds with a 2+ save and a big 4+ invulnerable, and they can give that 4+ invulnerable to nearby troops, providing a little bit of cover for the advancing Skitarii. For their weapons, they've got really quite a lot of options. I still feel like I've seen them used more with neutron lasers than anything else. 3 shots at strength 16, AP minus 4 and damage d6 plus 2, and able to have that damage output boosted by Doctrina Imperatives too. Overall I feel like they're solid enough firepower, not really a bad unit for its battlefield role, though I'd perhaps still be a bit more tempted by the Scorpius Disintegrators for the anti-tank role. They just seem a little bit more efficient and general purpose. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 here. Speaking of which, the other mainline battle tank for the AdMech is the Scorpius. 175 points again gets you a fairly sturdy tank, 12 wounds with a 2+ save, and this one gets a big heavy hitting Ferromite cannon, 3 shots at strength 12, AP minus 3, d6 plus 1, but also backs that up with a bunch of disruptor missiles, a further 3 shots at strength 9, AP 2 and damage d6, all with twin linked. And between those two it means that you've got quite a lot of shots that will both take a good chunk out of enemy tanks and vehicles, but also be quite a nice threat to enemy heavy infantry as well. It also moves a little bit faster versus the Dunecrawler and gets a +1 to hit against monsters and vehicles when it's equipped with a Ferromite cannon. Currently they often tend to be a mainstay for anti-tank in AdMech lists. I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. For the Knights of Titan, their most commonly used armoured units tend to be their Dread Knights, and they often dish out most of the firepower, though definitely don't really fit the role of battle tank really with their melee role too. And let's leave them mainly with the Land Raiders. They actually get 4 different variants of them, the 3 Codex ones, plus also the Forge World Land Raider Banisher. They do the same sort of role as they would in Codex Space Marines, though arguably for the Grey Knights they tend to be a bit more niche given that all the units can teleport around a bit. Maybe could be one option to do something like getting Purifiers to the front lines if you wanted to use them as a big high investment unit. There you could use a Rhino if you wanted transports, or just do teleport things. I guess Lascannon 5 could be at least fairly punchy in their Warpbane task force, getting the inbuilt rerolls if they're within the zone of control. I've given them a 6 out of 10 here, tend to be really quite niche, though I have occasionally seen them used in competitive lists. The Land Raider Banisher is the Forge World datasheet. That one's 255 points for a Land Raider that gets heavy incinerators on the side sponsons, and then a top-mounted twin side cannon. Maybe the biggest downside being that it just doesn't really do too much that a Land Raider Redeemer doesn't. The incinerator shots are basically just slightly worse Flamestorm cannons pretty much, getting a similar average number of shots, but the Flamestorm cannons get AP 2 and damage 2, so it hit far harder against medium infantry. It is 30 points cheaper than the Redeemer though, but I think despite it being a unique variant it's probably more niche than that. I've given it a 5 out of 10. Finally for the Imperium, we've got the Imperial Knights, and for the purposes of this video I'm not counting things like the big Crusaders or Castellans as battle tanks. They're very much big stompy robots. Just for having basically the same battlefield role, I'll give the Armigers and War Dogs that are purely dedicated range a mention here, with the Armiger Helverins at 130 points being really quite an efficient gun turret unit for the Knights. These guys are the squires and bannermen of the knightly households, lesser nobles that can maybe have less storage duties in their battle formations, the Helverins themselves having their Sky Reaper protocols to take down enemy flyers and keep the skies safe for the advancing Knights. Armigers and War Dogs in 40k at the moment just generally tend to be really quite powerful in themselves, 12 wounds at toughness 10, fast moving and with good OC. And their damage profiles are solid enough as well. The Helverins hitting with 8 shots at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3, utilising the built-in lay low the Tyrants rerolls, and being particularly potent against some fly targets if you can either be in your deployment zone or within range of an objective. Wounding Catan on a 2+ is particularly nice. They also have a rather good Squire's Duty stratagem as well to get you some AP and strength. Overall, Knight Armigers certainly seem to be doing well in 40k at the moment. It's not uncommon to see lists of them taking a huge amount of both these and Warglaves and doing very well. I've given them a 9 out of 10 currently. 130 points is a very good deal for them. Otherwise, if we're generous to include the Knight Moirax, given that you can take that with dedicated range profiles, I'll give it a quick shout out. 160 points for the Forge World Armiger, and he's got the choice of a bunch of different quite interesting guns. Maybe the Conversion Beamer being quite a fun one with its sustained hits and strength 10 damage 3, or a bunch of lightning lock shots at strength 8 AP 0 damage 1 if you want to get some anti-horde, which Knights don't really do quite so much. In general, there's nothing wrong with their profiles themselves, just their points cost are significantly more than the other Armigers that Knights can field, so they very much feel like a secondary option to the Warglaves and Helverins. I've given them a 6 out of 10. Won't be an enormous drag on our list, but certainly less efficient by direct comparison. Let's move on to the Forces of Chaos though, and given that we're on Knights, I thought we'd start with the Chaos equivalents. For the core Codex dedicated range variants, the Chaos Knights have their War Dog Brigands, basically a similar sort of profile but with a different variety of guns. 2 Demon Breath Spear shots, giving some all very punchy anti-tank with strength 12, damage d6 and a big melt of 4. A chain cannon that can put out some good shots against light infantry and make good use of its extra AP special rule for targeting the closest unit, and also a Havoc launcher on top that can chip into direct damage, but with a whole bunch of them in an army list you might be able to get quite a lot of damage 1 indirect fire. These things are still very much a mainstay of competitive Chaos Knight lists. It's a bit too common to see Chaos Knight lists taking almost nothing but War Dog Brigands and Carnivores, maybe with a few hangers-on. They're just the right combination of fast enough, tough enough, and dangerous enough with some good objective control, that if they're good, they're going to be worth it in numbers. I've given them a 9 out of 10 here. For their rivals in the Chaos Knight Codex, they do have the War Dog Executioner, which has the same sort of Armiger autocannon profiles, but otherwise beyond that quite a lot worse support versus the regular Imperial Knights. They don't get the Anti-Fly 2+ thing with quite a weaker special rule, and they don't get either the inbuilt rerolls or the 6+ Feel No Pain that the Loyalist version gets. Partly as a result of that and competition from the Brigand, they're a lot lesser played. Maybe not awful to have one as a sort of backfield objective grabber type knight. Their effective range is a fair bit longer than the Brigands, and the firepower is quite good against the right target, but in general I rate these far more niche than the Brigands. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10 just due to being really quite directly overshadowed. The Chaos Knights also have their Moirax variant as well. Again, I'd say these are even more niche than in the Imperials, if anything. The Chaos Knights have a whole bunch more War Dog variants to choose from. Plus, given they get the chain cannons as well, the anti-horde role that this could do with lightning locks maybe feels even less relevant. I've given them a 5 out of 10 here. Moving on to some heretical armour though, and for the Chaos generic tanks and demon engines, I thought I'd talk through them first from a more sort of generic Chaos Space Marine perspective, but then also mention them as is relevant to the Deity Legion codexes, as they basically get the same sort of datasheet with a few tweaks and some different special rules. First up, we have the Chaos version of the Predator Annihilator, 135 points, and some fairly standard issue long-serving Chaos armour. 10 wounds at toughness 11, its anti-tank rule with las cannons, and it can re-roll damage rolls against its favoured prey. In core Chaos Space Marines, it might want to take the Mark of Nurgle to get some sustained hits on the go with those las cannons, and every so often get those going off very efficiently, potentially on a 5+ in things like Pact-Bound Zealots. I say it's usable enough for core Codex Chaos Space Marines, but maybe just not quite as standout as a few of the other fire support choices. I've given it a 7 out of 10 there. Otherwise, for the Deity Legions, all of those bar the Emperor's Children get one of these. The Thousand Sons one maybe being the most overshadowed currently, might change with the Codex of course. The World Eaters get their rather fun profile with Ballistic Skill 4+, but a Rapid Fire 2 main las cannon, so if you're within 24 inches you're likely to get quite a lot of shots there, and you get to reroll wound and damage rolls against their favoured target up close. Overall quite destructive for the points cost, though maybe a little overshadowed by some of the other gun things they can field, and Death Guard get themselves a mortal wound rule, which is kind of okay, but maybe only a bit of a trade-off for the re-rolling damage results, as it doesn't trigger that reliably. The Death Guard I think have quite a lot of competition from their other demon engines that will probably mean that the Predator Annihilators aren't fielded so commonly. For the more autocannon anti-infantry variant, we've also got the Chaos Predator Destructor, siling down enemy troops with autocannons and heavy bolters, though as mentioned they often take las cannons just to have a really quite general purpose threat. The regular Chaos Space Marine one is generally quite a nice gun turret for them, often using sustained hits from Dark Pacts, maybe the Mark of Nurgle in Pact Bound, and could get on pretty well with Renegade Raiders as well, getting AP-2 against things on objectives. In general with sustained hits, they're just pretty effective all-round danger units, able to take care of both tanks and heavy infantry. For the Deity Legions, again, all the legions bar Emperor's Children have one of these, the Thousand Sons one again being rather overshadowed compared with their other choices. The World Eaters one again gets its flavour of Ballistic Skill 4+ and Rapid Fire. Their option has the option to suppress enemies for a -1 to hit, which I think is alright, but maybe not crazy right home against their other gun things. And the Death Guard hands out an AP debuff versus non-vehicles and non-monsters, and also has lethal hits on the autocannon and heavy bolters. I'd probably rate all of those a little bit less standout for their factions versus the Predator Destructor for the standard Chaos Space Marines though. Next up we've got the Chaos Vindicator, basically the spiky version of the Loyalist Siege tank, 185 points, crawling up the board behind its enormous siege shield dozer blade, and cracking enemy tanks and fortifications with the Demolisher cannon. Again it's really quite sturdy with toughness 11, 11 wounds and a 2+ save, and gets a fair few shots with blast at strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6, and the ability to fire within melee. It'll also get on very well with sustained hits from the Dark Pacts, and also enjoys both Renegade Raiders and Pact Bound quite a bit, fast moving and extra AP against objectives, or potentially Mark of Nurgle for 5+ sustained hits. For the Deity Legions it's just the Thousand Sons that get one of these, though again like the other tanks they tend to be rather neglected versus their Sorceress picks. Next up we've got the Big Gun Demon Engine with the Forge Fiend at 180 points. These ones are Dinobots, crewed by possessed demons as opposed to crew, either with the option for some Hades autocannons or big blasts of plasma with a triple ectoplasma cannon. 180 points for the standard Heretic Astartes, maybe not crazy standout on the durability front with 12 wounds at toughness 10 with a 5+ invulnerable save, but with the triple ectoplasma cannon they're just very general purpose. 3d3 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3 is nice enough to hurt medium armour quite well. But with multiple copies of Blast it just means that they're super savage against both light and medium infantry, potentially able to kill a lot of Space Marines or Terminators in one go. They can also flex into devastating wounds if it makes sense as well, if they want to take out something with a high invulnerable save. Again, Dark Pacts will help them out for core Chaos Space Marines, and they feel like they're one of the ones that could be a bit more interesting in Pact Bound again, potentially even going undivided for reroll wound rolls with devastating wounds, and as a Demon Engine it could do quite well in the Soulforged Warpack as well. They went down a little bit compared with their points cost before, and I feel like that's made them a little bit more competitive with things like Predator tanks. I've given them an 8 out of 10 here. Otherwise, for the Deity Legions, the Thousand Sons get one. I'd say out of their various gun tank units, it might be the most standout one. Also fairly general purpose, a fair bit cheaper at 145 points, and hands out a -1 to hit. The World Eaters one maybe seems like the absolute most standout one though. For its 150 points it's looking rather brutal, 3d3 shots plus blast, and then all the ectoplasma cannons get rapid fire at 1 as well, so you get 9 shots within half range, re-rolling all hit rolls to counteract the ballistic skill 4+, so it basically means that if you get within 18 inches of this one you're going to get shot in a really big way. If anything I'd probably rate the World Eaters one as even stronger than the core Chaos Space Marine one right now. Finally, for the more generic Chaos Space Marine armour, we've got the Chaos Land Raider, 240 points, for a big and spiky armoured transport to get your Terminators or Elites into battle. Very tough with a toughness 16 and 12 wounds, and one option if you want to get some Chaos Space Marine Elites into melee with its assault ramp. They do have a fair few options to choose from with Terminators, Legionaries and Chosen. For the Heretic Astartes though, they do tend to be kind of niche, the main problem being that lots of their units either are happy not going in a big expensive transport or jumping out of a Rhino. Rhinos tend to be preferred for the Legionaries and also for the Chosen as well, who can advance and charge after disembarking, so it usually makes far more sense for them and it's far cheaper to basically get the same job done. Terminators take up a lot of slots and they can deep strike and rapid ingress to get them there, and possess move quite quickly. It means that while there's nothing particularly wrong with the transport, it just generally tends to get seen as a suboptimal pick. Otherwise, for the Deity Legions, literally all 4 of them get a Land Raider. I guess pretty iconic to the Chaos Space Marines in general. Thousand Sons more than most lack good units to transport. Scarab Occult Terminators are their only real melee ones, and they can deep strike or just want to be out of the transport to get their Psychic to work. The World Eaters ones at least look fun with their rapid fire las cannons at ballistic skill 4+ and boosted melee, but again their units are pretty happy to get there without. Khorne Berserkers move 8 inches and can jump out of Rhinos, and 8-bound move 10, so they don't really need transport so much. Terminators once more can deep strike and don't generally tend to be massively worth the big investment given that they take up 2 slots. The Emperor's Children again compete against their Thrill Seeker delivery. Everything can advance and charge, so it means that they can't be going too much faster in a Land Raider. And then for the new Death Guard, Death Shroud feel like they could have been interesting on paper. The Land Raider got its transporter capacity extended, so you have 7 slots in it now, so you could have 6 Death Shroud plus a character. But at the same time they gave Death Shroud a really powerful deep strike special rule, being able to make charges from 6 inches away, so they can get there that way anyway. I guess they could be used to deliver Plague Marine melee, but again Rhinos can work almost as well for that and at a much cheaper cost. Overall the Chaos Land Raider feels like it's just in a kind of usable place, but generally not a tournament optimised pick for just about every single one of the Deity Legions. I gave it a 7 out of 10 for the Core Codex Chaos Marines. Otherwise, for a couple of Deity Legion options, for the new Death Guard we've got the Plague Burst Crawler. They're a Demon Engine artillery tank, advancing inexorably across the battlefield, a great big mortar hurling out blights to infect their enemies at a long range. They're 195 points and that gets you a 12 wound tank with toughness 10 and a 2+ save. Kind of alright durability for the cost, though not crazy standout given how expensive they are. The Plague Burst Mortar gives you a bit of artillery fire, though it does feel like a hybrid tank with a bit of indirect, plus also some direct fire shooting, a pair of entropy cannons at strength 10 and damage d6+1, or you can swap them out for Plague Spitters. In the Codex it also gained a sort of splash damage mortal wound thing. When it hits a target, that target and things nearby have a chance of taking some mortal wounds as well, which is kind of fun. Usually just on a 6+, so quite a low chance, but if units are afflicted with the contagions of Nurgle, there's a bit more chance of it happening. For their overall power, I've given them a very Nurgle 7 out of 10. They're definitely paying a big premium for their damage output, as a good chunk of it is artillery, but feels like they do have some potential between all the buffs that they can have. Nurgle's gift could potentially worsen toughness and boost AP, and a Lord of Virulence could get you 2 reroll hits with it as well. Having a bit of threatening indirect fire can be a really helpful thing to mess with enemy units and objectives. I'll also mention the other Death Guard Demon Engines, though I feel like their feel of them just isn't really tanks really. At the start of the video I said 11 wounds as the cutoff, and I feel like these ones might well play like gun support vehicles but don't really feel like tanks quite so much, with the Feated Bloat Drone and the Mephitic Blight Hauler. I think probably worth a mention though, given that they're sort of sturdy light vehicles with some fairly ferocious firepower. If we do count them, then the Bloat Drone's 100 points for a hovering engine of Nurgle, 10 wounds at toughness 9 and a 5+ invulnerable save, which is fairly adequate durability for the cost, and then nice general purpose firepower with a blast shot of a heavy blight launcher. D6+2 shots at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3, potentially contagions, meaning that their target will be at -1 toughness and they could get extra AP against them. They could get other buffs on top of that as well. Maybe one of the easiest being from the Lord of Virulence once again. Rerolling all hit rolls with that profile means they're going to be incredibly accurate and wound quite a lot. Overall they're looking like a very scary unit in the new Death Guard Codex. I feel like a lot of lists might have a few of them hovering around and bringing up the rear in terms of fire support. I've given them a 9 out of 10 here. Maybe feeling a little bit similar to a very mini tank, we've got the Mephitic Blight Hauler, a small and fairly fast crawling demon engine with a similar defensive profile, and instead that one gets a multi-melter and missile launcher, the multi-melter having lethal hits now, and they now all get a +1 to hit and wound monsters and vehicles in the shooting phase, so they're fairly cheap and efficient firepower, both against enemy medium infantry just with their profiles, and enemy tanks and monsters as well. Feels like you could make a pretty nasty light demon engine list with Death Guard right now, with loads of these guys running around. Again, they look very nicely strong. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here. Otherwise for the Deity Legions, one more slightly borderline pick that definitely feels more like a monster than a gun tank really, is the Mutalith Vortex Beast. In reality probably more of a hybrid role, so maybe being a bit generous including it here. but it is a great big lumbering slow thing that's got a bunch of wounds and a powerful shooting attack, so I thought it'd be generous and throw it in for fun factor. The Warped Mutalith Beast has a great big portal of chaos on its back, blasting out some enemies at change at its foes. On the toughness side of things, it's fairly sturdy. 13 wounds at toughness 10 with a 5+ feel no pain means that there's quite a lot of wounds to slog through, and it does get a 5+ invulnerable save to turn some anti-tank fire away. Then it gets the choice of 3 fairly punchy profiles with its Warp Vortex, maybe the scariest one being a single strength 18 shot at AP 4 and damage D6 plus 6, the potential to end a tank in a single shot if it rolls well, but 2 others to flex to if it needs to take down some medium or light infantry. Otherwise it can double the range of some Kabbalistic rituals, maybe having Doombolt flashing away at 36 inches, throws out some mortal wounds to enemies nearby, and also does have a bit of melee with its claws. Overall a pretty solid support piece for the Thousand Sons. Even though they went up to 165 points, there still tends to be one in most competitive lists. I've given it an 8 out of 10 here. Finally for the Chaos, that leaves the Demons, which I feel like compared with any of them maybe are the ones that most lack for an obvious category for a gun tank. For things that feel a lot lighter than tanks and are more chariot type things, there's the Burning Chariot of Tzeentch and the Skull Cannon of Khorne, both of which tend to be on the niche side. The Lord of Change maybe could be one that if you wanted to point a finger at a big ranged monstrous creature. With its wings and sort of HQ status though, it feels a long way from a battle tank. Quite a scary model with its sorcerer's firepower though, of course. And if you just wanted something big, lumbering and armoured, I guess that would be the Soul Grinder, though it absolutely feels like a mixed role entity more akin to something like a Redemptor Dreadnought or something, rather than a battle tank. I feel like in general though the Chaos Demons feel like the army that's got least in common with the battle tank style role. Let's move on to the tanks of the Xenos now, and first up we have the Aeldari. The Aeldari tanks tend to be faster and more finely crafted than the lumpen tanks of the other races, one particularly good example being the Falcon Grav tank, combining the heavy firepower of a pulse laser with the ability to deploy a small squad into battle, maybe dropping in from Cloud Strike. Aeldari tanks tend to be a bit more on the fast and fragile side, 12 wounds with a 3+ save though only toughness 9, it does have a big 14-inch movement though. The pulse laser is fairly general purpose, 3 shots at strength 9, AP 2 and damage D6, and they can back up with another heavy weapon, maybe a bright lance. Perhaps their most impressive thing though might be to deliver a small squad of aspect warriors into strike range, and with deep strike could be one way to get fire dragons where they need to be. The buffing rule that it has means that they might be able to reroll wound rolls, though they can do that against tanks and vehicles anyway. Might still not be useless though if they need to take down some heavy infantry as the only targets that they can shoot. With good move out of sequence shenanigans as well, could be handy enough for say aspect host or battle host to have things re-embark back into it, hopefully keeping them safe to strike once more in another turn. Overall definitely interesting enough to provide both a bit of firepower and get some aspect warriors where they need to be. I've given it an 8 out of 10 here. Otherwise, for the sort of Aeldari tank destroyer tank, we've got the Fire Prism, 160 points for a similar sort of profile, but instead of a pulse laser and transport capacity, this one gets the enormous prism cannon, a finely crafted perfect crystal making an enormous laser weapon, and multiple tanks have the ability to channel their beams through the firepower of one tank to link firepower and utterly destroy that one target. The Fire Prisms are 160 points each, and their prism cannon either gets 2 big shots at strength 18, AP 4 and damage 6, or can go for dispersed fire if you want to take down a bunch of Space Marines. If you're linking fire, it does reduce the amount of shots though now, so you could maybe have one Fire Prism poking its head around terrain and then 2 others channeling through it, but you'd only get 4 shots total, not 6 now. The shots are scary ones though, and they are pretty accurate, being able to reroll one hit and wound roll whenever they make attacks, so pretty reliable anti-tank that doesn't need further buffs, though perhaps a little bit on the overshadowed side versus other anti-tank options, perhaps particularly fire dragons at the moment. Overall I've given them a 7.5 out of 10, usable enough though a little bit on the fragile side, could be handy enough to use the option to scoot back behind terrain though after they've been shot a bit. For the Darkkin, we've got the gunboat skimmer that is the Drukhari Ravager. Again, maybe not really quite with the same feeling as a tank, but the closest thing that the Drukhari come to that. They're slightly more heavily armoured than their iconic Raider, still very fast, and sacrifice transport capacity for a trio of heavy weapons, often Dark Lances. For 110 points, that gets you an 11 wound and toughness 9 skimmer. They also move very fast at 14 inches, and then typically if they're armed with the 3 Dark Lances that they often are, that'll be 3 shots at strength 12, AP 3 and damage D6 plus 2. Ravagers also get to reroll hit rolls of 1 against anything that's at its starting strength, and you could potentially dial up their damage output with a pain token. Maybe if they weren't getting their rerolls, that'd have a bit more value. Fully re-rolling the hit rolls. I feel like for 110 points they're a fairly good deal for what you get. Not super tough, but pretty long range and dangerous, at least for those big hitting Dark Lances for the points cost that you pay for them. They're maybe competing a bit against Scourges with their jump shoot jump shenanigans to keep them safe. Overall, I've given them a 7.5 out of 10, solidly usable but maybe not absolutely auto-include or anything. Next up for the Tyranids, we've got their living equivalents of battle tanks. The Exocrine is 140 points and is basically a great big gun beast, an enormous symbiotic bioplasma cannon jutting out of its carapace. In game, Exocrines are 140 points, get a fairly good defensive profile for that with 14 wounds at toughness 10 and a 3+ save, and then get some pretty solid firepower against enemy infantry, both medium and heavy ones. D6 plus 3 shots at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3, both with blast and heavy, which could both increase the damage yield, but it's just quite a nice profile for dealing with things like Terminator equivalents and standard Space Marines. If you hit something, then you get to reroll hit rolls of 1 against the same targets, and they might enjoy being near to a Hive Tyrant, being able to move around fast with Onslaught and still be firing as they do so, and also getting lethal hits either from him or from Invasion Fleet. Overall, they're a fairly near auto-include choice for the majority of Tyranid army lists, just as they don't have all that many things that can really deal with tough stuff super well. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here. Otherwise, for the big lumbering gun beasts, we have the Tyrannifex, now up to 200 points for its big stats and big hitting gun. This guy basically being the Tyranid incarnation of a walking heavy tank. It's got a pretty enormous and durable carapace, 16 wounds at toughness 12 and a 2+ save, so basically Land Raider style durability but for only 200 points, and it gets one of the rules to be able to cancel a saving throw if it gets shot by something with a really high damage characteristic. For its damage output, most take the Rupture Cannon, a big scary 2 shots at strength 18, AB 4 and a big D6 plus 6, but without any inbuilt rerolls, so potentially you can get very unlucky. It's definitely a bit of a casino cannon, again could maybe have some good value from a Hive Tyrant being nearby, even just feeding command point rerolls into the Rupture Cannon could add a lot of value. Again, it's one of the few Tyranid organisms that can deal with heavies really quite well, tends to get included in a whole bunch of army lists as a result. I've given him an 8.5 out of 10 here, maybe could have been persuaded to give him a 9 if I was feeling a bit more generous. Finally for the Tyranids, we've got the Maleceptor at 170 points. This one the big sturdy brain bug, and perhaps it's a little bit dual role, having a tiny bit of melee, though still mainly a big sturdy gun bug that does most of its damage via its psychic. The Maleceptor's 170 points, and for that you get a 14 wounds, toughness 11, pretty chunky and hard to kill bug, with its additional defences from its power of the Hive Mind, with a 4+ invulnerable save and a nice debuff up close, potentially debuffing the enemies for a -1 to hit and maybe a -1 to wound as well if it's within 6 inches of them. That means it can be a little bit harder to kill in melee than at range. For its damage output, it gets Psychic Overload, so D6 plus 3 attacks at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3, quite nice in general purpose. It does have a small amount of melee to back it up, though maybe not quite so standout. It can be helpful enough to be a Synapse organism on the front line as well, so it could be good to have in the advance alongside non-Synapse things moving forward. Overall, it's pretty reasonable value all around for what it does. Fairly tough, fairly dangerous, and has a bit of extra utility as well. They tend to be not quite so commonly played versus, say, Exocrines and Tyrannifexes, and Norn Emissaries maybe also have a good rival for their role. I still rate it as a pretty strong unit though. I've given it an 8 out of 10 here, maybe probably weighing up between somewhere around 7.5 to 8 if I had to decide though. For the Genestealer Cults, their big armoured vehicle is the Goliath Rock Grinder, 120 points for a very deadly looted mining vehicle, a big gun with a mining laser or clearance incinerator or something, probably a mining laser, and then mounting a drill dozer blade, so again it is a bit more of a hybrid role between range and melee. It maybe isn't particularly standout on the durability front, 10 wounds at toughness 10, but does have a fair bit of threat at least, D3 las cannon style shots with the mining laser with blast, and then a bunch of strength 10 attacks in close combat with the drill dozer blade. It can transport a small squad of acolytes into battle to do some scoring or objective shenanigans, and could also have the potential to cause a little bit of disruption with its desperate escape rule if it manages to tag something in melee. They feel like they're maybe a little bit on the niche side in Genestealer Cult lists. I've seen a few people using them in the Final Day one. I guess that could be helpful enough to keep the mining laser accurate amongst other things. Overall feels pretty usable, though maybe not crazy standout for the Genestealer Cults. I've given it a 7.5 out of 10 here. For the Space Dwarves, the Leagues of Votann have their Hecaton Land Fortress as their primary big chunky battle tank. Their enormous sort of big armoured moon rover style vehicle, bristling with a whole bunch of high-tech firepower. In game it's 225 points to field, and also gets the sort of Land Raider equivalent stat line, 16 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ save, and that can be quite sturdy with access to void armour too. For its weapon options, it gets a bunch of bolt cannons, often tends to use the SP Heavy Conversion Beamer as the primary choice of ranged weapon, with the sustained hits D3 that goes off on a 4+ at greater than 12-inch range. and also has an autocannon, and everything gets to ignore cover with its scanner. It's quite a lot of firepower and could be an okay choice for the Sustained Hits 2 stratagem, or the one that allows you to fire back when it's taken some damage. Plus it's also got a transport capacity as well, so it could be used to deliver Chthonian Berserks or Ironhair Hearthguard to the front lines. Its special rule could allow you to reroll wound rolls with their Vulcanite blasters, and maybe fish for a few more devastating wounds. Overall, they're certainly a solid competitive unit for the leagues. Perhaps the most cookie-cutter meta leagues of Votann list tend to use a couple of these with the conversion beamers. Seems like they're solid enough mainline damage dealers to justify their place. For the leagues of Votann, I thought it'd be slightly generous and also mention the Sagittor as well, even though it is a dedicated transport and for the most part I've been avoiding those. It feels like for the role that it has though, it's pretty much being used as a hybrid unit, the unit inside being bought to get the Sagittor as much as the other way round. Sagittors are 115 points, and that gets you a 9 wounds toughness 10 transport, either filled with Chthonian Berserks or Hearthkin Warriors, both work in small 5-man squads. The Sagittor allowing you to split the Hearthkin into small efficient ones. They can then scout 6 inches up the board, so should be in a good place to get into good firing lanes. If the enemy is exposed, they might be able to get some good alpha strikes or hide from enemy reprisals if they happen to get the first turn. Typically they tend to take the high las beam cannon, 2 attacks with sort of las cannon style profiles but with damage d6 and getting sustained hits d3. They also have a bolt cannon as well, sort of tamish damage output without judgment tokens, but if they get +1 to hit and wound then they get seriously nastier. Overall they tend to be another staple part in leagues of Votann army lists, often taking 3 or 4 of them in a lot of competitive armies. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here. Moving on to the tanks of the Tau Empire, and first up we have the Hammerhead, a high-tech grav tank famed for mounting the fearsome railgun, capable of shooting straight through an Imperial tank and out the other side. Hammerheads cost 145 points in game, get 14 wounds at toughness 10, so sort of alright durability but maybe not standout for the cost. Get a pair of burst cannons and some seeker missiles for a nice alpha strike, and then get the choice between the fearsome railgun or the ion cannon, both of which are usable enough. The railgun having a massive shot at strength 20, AP 5 and damage d6 +6, so some pretty crazy stats there but can be very swingy on a bad roll or two. They are at least fairly likely to convert from a hit and a wound roll due to the targeting relay that they have though for a single inbuilt reroll. Otherwise they have the option of an ion cannon, d6 +3 shots at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3 when it's overcharged, so quite nice for killing Terminators, and that profile quite enjoys Montcar as well for some lethal hits to make it really quite general purpose. Hammerheads also get an inbuilt +1 to hit monsters and vehicles as well, so both guns get helped out against those targets just that bit more. Overall at the moment most Tau options seem at least fairly well balanced, but not really having too much that stand out for the cost. The Hammerhead might have a bit of frustration between trying to get guides against one target and also wanting to split fire with some good burst cannon profiles that get more inaccurate if they don't fire against the guided target too. Overall I've given it a 7.5 out of 10, solid value for the cost though maybe not crazy standout like much of the rest of Tau. Next up and quite well balanced against the Hammerhead is the Skyray, this one being the missile defense gunship that packs some marker lights and is particularly good for taking down flying targets. Instead of a single big railgun shot, it strikes with a seeker missile rack, 3 shots at strength 14, AP -3 and damage d6 +1 and the twin links keyword, and he still gets to reroll a single hit roll with the targeting array. It means that compared with the Hammerhead railgun, it's perhaps a little bit less swingy, but doesn't have quite as good of an alpha strike given that it doesn't get the bonus seeker missiles on the first time that it fires. Otherwise for its bonus special rule you also get to reroll hits against targets that fly. Overall I think they're both usable for what they do. I've also given this one a 7.5 out of 10. Next up for the Tau, I thought I'd also mention the 2 big battle suits that sort of fit in the same sort of weight class as the tanks, even if realistically they aren't really gun tanks and have quite a different feel. The Riptide is a big advanced Tau battlesuit with a Nova reactor and a big shield generator, able to channel power to different parts of the suit as the bearer most needs, and made with some fancy iridium armour. In game there are 190 points and are fairly sturdy with 14 wounds at toughness 9 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. They typically get equipped with an ion accelerator, so 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 4, plus a backup secondary weapon system. They ignore modifiers and get devastating wounds once per game. They also like the big damage boost that you can potentially get from Montcar or Kauyon late game. Perhaps one of its better advantages though is being able to fall back and shoot, so it could be used a bit more bravely to contest midfield objectives or get good firing lines, knowing that if it gets tagged it can still fall back and fire to full effect. Between that and quite good durability, they're often on the front lines. Overall definitely more of a battlesuit than a tank, even if it acts in a similar kind of way. I've given it a 7.5 out of 10 for power overall. Again, really quite usable, though not really stand out for the points cost, maybe lacking just a bit of damage that you might like on that ion accelerator. Finally for Tau, I thought I'd also mention the Ghost Kill as well. Again, a battlesuit, not a tank, but also a big tough ranged unit that operates in a similar kind of way. This guy's the big tower stealth suit essentially, cloaking itself from the enemy's eyes and radars, and then all of a sudden you've got an enormous suit with some serious firepower, all ready to deal some massive damage in the place least expected. To fill ghost kills, currently they cost 160 points, they're 12 wounds at toughness 8 with a 2+ save, so at least relatively sturdy for that cost, and they also get stealth inbuilt as well, so even if you can get close enough to shoot them, they'll be at -1 to hit. On top of that though, their stealth shenanigans give them lone operative, so you can basically have them in the backfield, out exposed in the open, laying down a bit of firepower, and the opponent might not be able to interact with them, so they're quite good for both a utility piece, but can also genuinely tip into damage output a bit, though paying a big premium for its damage as you might expect for that. I've seen most of them used with the Cyclic Ion Raker, 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3. Fairly nice general purpose anti-elite firepower, then paired with a secondary weapon system. I feel like they're really going to be a terrible choice for Tau. They don't add loads to firepower, but I think they've got enough utility to make them well worth it between just guaranteeing not being shot early on and their damage and defensive profiles. But they're fairly common choices in competitive lists, maybe quite nice in Kauyon as well. I've given them an 8 out of 10 overall. Moving on to more violent Xenos, and we have the Orks. Unlike the Tower, the vast majority of their walking dreads are generally ranged and melee focused, and probably the single best thing that fits the tank bill for them is the Battle Wagon, a great big looted mech creation, with massive holes to get big mobs of boys into the battle, and often covered with all sorts of fancy guns and adornments, including dozer blades and wrecking balls and things. For its 160 points, the Battle Wagon's really quite tanky. It's got a big 16 wounds at toughness 10 with a 3+ save, that's often effectively a 2+, as it worsens enemy damage output by 1 AP. And if you don't either need a firing deck or to transport Gazgul, we can also take the Ard case as well, for bumping its toughness up to a big 12, making it just kind of ridiculously durable for the cost. Its main role is to get a whole bunch of Orks into melee pretty safely, and hopefully absorb a lot of enemy firepower while doing so, but it does have a bit of damage it can do. It's got several different big gun profiles, including being able to mount a kill cannon if desired. Maybe more reliable damage is its Death Roller and melee though. With a bunch of strength 9 and damage 2 attacks, it might be able to rogue kill a fair few Space Marines and back that up with grabbing claws and wrecking balls. Overall, they generally get used as maybe slightly luxury picks for big units of boys with bosses or other combos of greenskin elites to get into battle. For the majority of things, trucks tend to get used a bit more than battle wagons, but these wagons are also genuinely strong with all their toughness and a bit of threat of their own right. I've chosen to give them an 8 out of 10 for power. Otherwise for the Orks, maybe not really having quite the same feel as a tank, but operating in a similar sort of way, is the Beastnagger contraption in the Kill Rig. Really quite cheap at the moment at 155 points. And this one just feels kind of hard to go too far wrong with in any direction. For its cost, it's pretty tough with 16 wounds, toughness 10, and a 6+ feel no pain. It has some accurate shooting in the Whir Tower, which you can use for Overwatch in a weird sort of anti-tank Overwatch, plus a couple of other guns as well. Has some alright melee between a bunch of extra attack profiles, should be okay to put some damage on medium infantry quite well. Transports a mob of Beastnaggers to get nearby, likely 10 Beastnagger boys with a Beast Boss, and then has the chance to help out in the fight phase, handing out some lethal hits to things nearby. In general, likely needs a Beast Boss and Beastnagger boys to be transported inside it, but otherwise for its points cost it just brings a whole load of things to the table. Pretty good damage and defense in its own right while it's doing its transport things. I've given it an 8.5 out of 10 here. Maybe not exactly right for every Ork army list out there, but I do see some competitive play. Finally, we've got the Necrons, with their equivalent of battle tanks often hovering around on sophisticated anti-grav or striding forward on great legged constructs. The Annihilation Barge might have a little bit more in common with a sort of speeder or gun platform versus a tank, but I feel like it seems in the same sort of class. Basically a hollow platform for an enormous twin Tesla destructor. To field these in game, they cost 105 points and have kind of middling durability, 9 wounds at toughness 8 but with a 4+ invulnerable save. And they get a primary and secondary weapon, the big Tesla destructor getting 6 shots at strength 8, AP 0, damage 2, but with sustained hits 2, twin links, and the ability to splash some mortal wounds to units nearby. It's genuinely not unusable for some cheap Necron fire support, though I think the AP 0 really does let down the Tesla destructor. It means that just a lot of armies with good saves will shrug off the vast majority of its damage, even if it does land a whole bunch of hits. The mortal wound thing could be good in the middle of a vast formation if you roll well, but it's kind of unreliable scattergun damage. Overall, as rated, not awful, but definitely not standout. I've given it a 6.5 out of 10 here. Next up, and probably for the Necron's closest tank equivalent, is the Doomsday Ark. Again, basically a quantum shielded platform for an enormous technological gun, and a slightly famously quite hard kit to put together with all of those rib sections along its carapace. The Doomsday Arks now cost 200 points again, and have got pretty good damage and defense stats for the cost. 14 wounds at toughness 9, but with a 4+ invulnerable save, and as they often want to hang back a bit. That's usually pretty adequate to keep them alive at long range, particularly with living metal to allow them to regrow some wounds. For the Doomsday Cannon, it is a bit random. D6 plus 1 attacks at strength 18, AP 4 and damage 4. You can definitely roll very high and very low. Ideally it quite wants to stay stationary if it can. It gets the heavy keywords to hit on a 2+ and gets devastating wounds when it's static. It's still got good threat even if it has to be on the move though, which it often will be. And for any enemies getting close nearby, they'll have 20 gas flare shots to contend with as well, so it can be quite good at repelling lighter enemy infantry from the deployment zone. Overall I still rate these as really quite strong for the points cost. Nice warping around the board in Hypercrypt Legion, with lots of good stuff that they can do in Star Shatter Arsenal. I've chosen to give them a 9 out of 10 here. Otherwise, for a couple of things that maybe fall into the sort of walking tank sort of area for Necrons. Next up we have the command and control Triarch thing that is the Triarch Stalker, walking forward on some great sized limbs and commanding some Necron firepower. These have had a few points cut since the Necron Codex came out. 110 points now gets you a Toughness 8 12 wound construct with a 4+ invulnerable save, and then either a Heat Ray Particle Shredder or a Heavy Gauss Cannon. Triarch Stalkers can scout 8-inch forward into the midboard. As well as their range damage, they have a bunch of strength 7 and damage 3 attacks with their stalking limbs, and then can strip the benefit of cover from one enemy unit, which could be quite a nice benefit if you've got a whole bunch of Necron firepower to back it up with. I've seen a few people use them in Star Shatter Arsenal to help out with other Necron firepower and be another Necron vehicle unit that can use their stratagems well. I feel like they're usable enough between their disruption and their scout threat plus marking firepower. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here for their fairly cheap points cost. Next up we've got the War of the Worlds Canoptek construct that is the Canoptek Doomstalker. 145 points for an automaton style creation that packs a mini version of the Doomsday Cannon from the Doomsday arc. For its cost it's also adequately tough, 12 wounds at toughness 8 with a 4+ invulnerable save, and its weapon is fairly punchy in general purpose, though not quite so much as the Doomsday arc's gun. Again d6 plus 1 shots at strength 14, AP 3 and damage 3, so losing a touch of strength and damage there, but maybe more importantly hitting on a 4+ not a 3. It also gets a pair of Gauss flares and the ability to fire Overwatch on a 5+. Overall, between its damage and defense, in general it adds up that the Doomsday Arc is a fair bit more efficient and definitely has some good advantages like faster movement and way more close-range Gauss flare support. As a result, Canoptek Doomstalkers tend to be taken more in Canoptek Court than anywhere else, where in their themed detachment they can get access to some big rerolls to hit with their power matrix and also some good stratagem support such as being able to shield them from enemy shooting halfway through their shooting phase. Overall I'd say they're not standout, not useless, definitely better there than elsewhere though. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10. Finally, I thought we would mention the big Necron Super Heavy in the Monolith. Again, maybe a little bit dubious and not having the same sort of feel as most battle tanks of several factions, but it is basically a big ranged, slow-moving support unit. I think I would stick to just the Monolith and not go for the Obelisk and the Tesseract Vault. They just have a bit of a different feel to me. The Monolith is the iconic Necron Blackstone Space Pyramid, a great portal for more Necrons to emerge through it, Necron warriors warping into the fray, summoned from places far away. They're a titanic and towering vehicle, costing 400 points to field in-game, and for that you get a fairly good defensive stat line, 22 wounds at a big toughness 13 that last cannons won't like, and a 2+ save. Hopefully she'll live long enough to regenerate with some living metal, and could be helped out by things nearby such as a Canoptek Spider. For their weapons they typically get armed with 4 Death Rays, big shots at strength 12, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 1, all with sustained hits d3 as well. Then a fairly general purpose particle whip, 3d6 shots at strength 8 and damage 2, all with blast and devastating wounds. It has perhaps a surprising amount of melee with its Portal of Exile, a bunch of strength 8 and damage 3 hits, and then particularly in Hypercrypt has a whole bunch of teleport utility. It's got Deep Strike itself, so it could be warping itself around the board, and then also using big stratagems to set up Necron infantry close, potentially rescuing them from enemy shooting with a couple of command points, or just having another option of 4 places to arrive them onto the board, as well as the board edges. Overall, after the points increases to it, I feel like it's not unreasonably costed. There may be a fair bit more standout in Hypercrypt versus the other detachments. I've given it a 7.5 out of 10 here. And with that done, that's just about it. One quick summary of every battle tank in Warhammer 40k, plus adding in a whole bunch of things that either function or feel like them. Let me know your thoughts on the tanks in your army. Do they get put on the table in your army regularly or not? Look forward to hearing all your insights down in the comments. As mentioned earlier, a big thank you to Cubicle 7 Games for sponsoring this video. There'll be links down in the video description if you want to check them out. They're the makers of Warhammer 40k RPG games, so sort of Dungeons and Dragons but for Warhammer. So if you like the idea of you and a party trekking through an Imperial hive and encountering all sorts of nastiness, then feel free to check that out, linked in the video description. A big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones out every day. And if you'd like to help support the channel, then check out all the links in the video description. If you're picking up any tanks or other 40k models, the affiliate discount retailers can save some money versus Games Workshop and also help to support Auspex Tactics a little bit. And there's the channel Patreon page if you'd like to support more directly as well. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.